Wonderful discussion. So we are live on YouTube. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening at the same time to our participants and our guests for this afternoon's, from our point of view, in Lithuania and Belarus afternoon session. The third one already in our series, the World HandCOV'd. I have to apologize today that we change again the format where we're streaming this onto. The first time we had it on YouTube, the second time on Facebook. Today this function isn't working, so we're live on YouTube today, not on Facebook as last week, sorry. But all of those of you who don't understand English and want to listen to this in Russian, please feel free to join us on Zoom. The link has been sent out and shared. So today we are going to talk about China. China is often described or symbolized either as a dragon, sometimes as a panda bear in cartoons and caricatures. But over the last two sessions, we have seen that it's more of an elephant in the digital room, a magnetic elephant, you might want to say, because all the debates somehow are being dragged towards China at some point. So today is neither the first time nor the last time for sure that we're going to speak about China, but today we're going to speak about China very directly. Not only, but very directly about China. You have seen over the last weeks, we've had also a lot of questions already. We said, please keep them in the back of your head. China is up on a different day. Yohini and I, when we spoke about the outset of the series, which topics and states we want to discuss at what point, we were very sure China has to be one of the first. First of all, obviously, because China is the place where the COVID pandemic started geographically. You all know that there's been a struggle between the US and China, where President Trump has been trying even to coin this, name this the China virus. And it is also the country that prides itself in having defeated it successfully, and having applied strong strategies to cope with it, and now inspiring other countries, or being a role model to follow the Chinese way of combating this. China has been using public diplomacy, reaching out a hand in help, but also applying pressure to other countries when it comes to criticism of them. So today, it is very timely that we talk about China, not only because of its direct connection as the country where the coronavirus started, but because of its high relevance for the world, obviously, for world politics. It's a heavyweight as a nation state, but also as a member of institutions, not only for the Security Council of the United Nations, but also within other international bodies. It has grown in its weight and relevance. The influence of China is also particularly visible in Belarus. If you go to Minsk, you will see a lot of writings and signs in Chinese. At the airport, when you arrive, there's a lot of Chinese. At hotels, you might find that it says China friendly, and things are being translated into Chinese. So Belarus has been building up a partnership with China also in security issues. And I even heard a Belarusian expert say this week, who is also joining us today as a viewer, was a Chatham House setting, so I can't say his name. He said it is even positive for Belarusian security if China invests more, because then China is going to safeguard its investment, making sure that Belarus remains a free and sovereign country. An interesting argument. So as I said, today, people are joining us from both ends virtually of the globe. It could not be further away in the time difference. It's 8 p.m. in China and 8 a.m. in Canada. And it's 3 p.m. in Belarus and Lithuania, and 1 hour less in Berlin. So we have people joining us today. First of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Kirill Rude, who's joining us from Belarus. He is the former ambassador of the Republic of Belarus to the People's Republic of China, has been serving for about 4 years up to this year, and is now the independent director of the Development Bank of the Republic of Belarus. Professor Rude, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Our second expert is Captain Dr. Tian Zhijin, who is the former head of Department for Crisis Management and Media Relations in the Ministry of National Defense in China, and is today the Vice President and Senior Research Fellow at the Grandview Institution. So these are our experts who will be joining us for the discussion today. Then we have the authors of the two papers, which hopefully all of you have received and read in English and Russian. Dr. Sakharij Paikin, who is a visiting fellow at the Global Policy Institute and an expert council member of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. He's joining us from Canada. And last but certainly not least, it's my pleasure to introduce to you two of my colleagues from CAS. Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung has 3 offices in China, and they're being coordinated from Berlin. So one of our 2 co-authors of the CAS paper is Mr. David Merkle, who is the desk officer for China in the headquarters, And since the article that he has written with the second colleague, Lewe Powell, is focusing also on China's outreach in the region, Lewe is joining us and also wrote the paper because he's the desk officer for South Asia at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's headquarters in Berlin. So much from me. I'm looking very forward to a fierce and interesting discussion about China. Finally, it has been in the room, and today we're naming it. Thank you for joining us, and I give the floor to Joachim Prechermann.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for these wonderful introductory words, and thank you once again for all our panelists for finding and contributing your time, given the time differences. And of course, lots of thanks to those who are watching us now or are going to watch the discussion at a later point. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Zachary, who is going to provide some views from Canada, but also looking, of course, at China and its strategic dilemmas. So please, Zach, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Zhenya, for the invitation. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, or a simple hello, I suppose, will suffice for all of you. So the core argument of the paper that I provided for this session is effectively that if China in the post-COVID world wants to serve as a relatively stable pillar of the wider regional international order, it needs to find some sort of way to calibrate its global great power relations in a different fashion from the way that it's going to be approaching its intra-regional relations. And that's simply because the dynamics that are currently underway at the global level favor a consolidation of an increasingly rigid great power rivalry. And if this gets a little bit too much out of control, then China has the ability to be stretched quite thin across its entire region. And the result of this will be an increasingly rigid region as well, which is not necessarily in the cards at this point. So China and other great powers as well should be careful that their own disputes with one another do not necessarily spill over into an increasingly rigid region. What we've seen so far is that the existing China-West rivalry, which was already well underway before COVID, has been exacerbated significantly, and an early lesson to derive, and we already saw this very clearly 6 years ago with the beginning of the Russia-West unambiguous rivalry, is that if you have a Cold War of sorts, that is to say a zero-sum across-the-board state of competition between powers, it is very easy for that to become entrenched or to develop significantly if it is left unaddressed. The result of this increasingly rigid great power rivalry at this point implies that the Russia-China relationship in particular is going to remain on solid ground. And that means that both sides of that coin as well, the Sino-Russian relationship, will be prepared to weather any irritants in their bilateral relationship in order to achieve their larger great power interests vis-a-vis the West. They're going to be willing to desecuritize their own ties as much as is possible. And they're going to weather international criticism as well in order to pursue what they perceive as their core interests. And what the driving force behind the consolidation of both the Sino-Russian partnership and global great power rivalry, what that is these rival visions of international order that have allowed to proliferate at the global level over the past 30 years. The United States at this point in time still maintains effectively a zero-sum relationship with Russia and China, in which the United States must be the leading actor in Europe, it must be the leading security provider in the Asia-Pacific region, and this effectively does not allow for any sort of relationship of equals between the sides, which ensures that despite occasional periods of détente or dialogue, nonetheless, there will be a zero-sum rivalry that eventually becomes entrenched. It's an unfortunate situation. It is the reality. All great powers are going to have to acknowledge that it's the reality, and obviously the political conditions for any sort of détente are a long way away at this point, probably several years. But in the meantime, the key is to ensure that it does not descend even further within certain regions, to allow at least regions in this increasingly decentered and decentralized world. We should allow regions as much as possible to emerge as stable pillars of the wider international order. So that will include, in China's case, the Central Eurasian region, which it has with its neighbor Russia, in addition to the wider Indo-Pacific sort of maritime region as well. One final observation on how we can sort of think about this conceptually is that the descent of American hegemony has been remarkably rapid. In 2003, and it's interesting that we're still talking about the Iraq War today, it's been remarkably more than 17 years now since it was launched. And the reason we talk about it so much, I think, is because it was launched at the height not only of American power, material power and economic power, but also American influence as well, right? 2003 is right after the 1990s when the United States began to expand NATO and consolidate sort of capitalist liberal democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. It was a mere year and a half after, at the time, what seemed like a relatively successful intervention into Afghanistan. 20 years later, it looks a little bit less successful. And so at the time, it looked like the limits of American power were very few. But the invasion of Iraq, the Great Recession, which was also a made in the US crisis, and now the coronavirus crisis as well, to which the United States has responded clearly in a zero-sum and America first type fashion, and which the United States allowed to fester and did not respond to adequately, has allowed a sense to embake itself into the international system that the American model is not necessarily something to be emulated across the board, despite the fact that Americanization of the world will remain in various ways, and that American hegemony and American influence have been greatly devalued as well. So the speed with which that happened, how we went from a world of American unipolarity and hegemony in 2003 to a world defined now by great power rivalry and certainly no longer by American leadership a mere 17 years later, speaks to the speed with which we can actually see norms change on the international stage. And so all great powers should keep that in mind as well. If we hope to move towards a more cooperative framework going forward, we should be careful to note just how fragile, how delicate international norms can actually be. And that should be something on which I hope we can reflect a little bit today, and that individuals at all tracks of government and in the think tank world and the academic world can reflect on as well going forward as we enter this increasingly uncertain time.
Thank you very much, Zach. And we go directly to Berlin, to Leve.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Zachary, for these great insights. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to be here and briefly outline some of the points that my colleague David Merkel and I have made in our paper. And the title of this paper was China After COVID-19, Navigating Between Great Power Rivalry and International Stability. And the title of this paper picks up a theme that has been commonly discussed in international relations, and that is, of course, the growing rivalry between the United States and China as a rising power, and what kind of impact this strained relationship may have on global affairs. And this has also been described by many people as a battle of narratives. So it is clear right now that China is determined to become a global leader. And before the pandemic, Xi Jinping himself said that China must take center stage in the world. And I think by now we're all familiar with China's ambitions to have technological leadership and integrate much of the world into the Belt and Road Initiative. And now with the ongoing pandemic, we are experiencing what is arguably the most disruptive event since the Second World War. And in fact, it has often been named as a major disruption. So from this, it is very natural to ask if COVID-19 could be a tipping point of some sort. Could it be a game changer in the rivalry that we've been seeing between China and the US? And so what we try to do in our paper is what signs do we actually see in this regard? We try to outline what concrete signs are there actually for COVID-19 to be a tipping point. So the United States have been going down a very different course even before this COVID-19 pandemic struck. The allies of the United States have started to wonder if they could still count on the support of the US. And I think speaking from Berlin, that is very much the case, very resounding in political circles here. And in the course of the pandemic, it has become even clearer that the US haven't been acting as a global leader. And the most striking example of this is, of course, the funding freeze for the WHO. And it is exactly this behavior that is reinforcing the sentiment that multilateralism will eventually have been built and protected by those who truly see its added value. And at the same time, China's role in the pandemic is ambivalent, to say the least. So at home, it portrays itself as the leader in global aid and relief efforts. But at the same time, international observers still cast doubt on the truthfulness, on the veracity of China's reporting. And that starts right with the beginning of, with the attempts to cover up the COVID outbreak in December. So China may be on its way to becoming a superpower, but the world is still unsure how responsible and trustworthy China will be in this role. And there's signs that the gap between China's perception of itself, or at least the message that the government wants to promote at home, and the perception of the outside world of China is growing. And it is exactly this divergence, this gap in perceptions that, in our view, puts a stumbling block in China's path towards leadership that it has been charting for itself. And what we describe in our paper is that China will, in now the months and years to come, will continue to pursue a dual track approach to multilateralism. And we describe it as dual track because on the one hand, China nominally commits itself to multilateralism. And of course, that is as opposed to the United States at this time. And on the other hand, China is initiating new multilateral formats which challenge the existing architecture. And as the longer lasting consequences of the pandemic become clear, it seems likely that China will continue to use these channels that it has been building to promote itself as an international partner and continue to establish the rules that it prefers over the rules that have been sort of agreed on in the years since basically the Second World War. And so to sum up, so far the pandemic has reinforced some of the already emerging trends in international relations. The global order is being reshuffled and multilateralism is being reinterpreted. And then China, as the growing power, is using a dual track approach that calls the existing structures into question. And so in the battle of narratives between China and the United States, yeah, it's very much not a zero-sum game at the end of the day, we would argue, because both sides are in fact incurring big losses, and they're both suffering from this so-called battle of narratives. So as of now, the question of whether COVID-19 will be a game changer for China is far from settled. And this is very much still up for the debate that we can embark on now. And in our discussion now, we can maybe also turn to the question, to what extent does this also present an opportunity for the European Union? Because the European Union sort of stands between these two sides of China and the US, and it has been acting arguably in a more transparent and responsible way as a multilateral actor than the competing great powers. And I will leave it at that for now. And I thank you again, thank you to the organizers. And in the spirit of an equal partnership, my colleague David will then take over in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all these great points and arguments. And I can only remind for those who are watching us now that if you want to dig deeper into the arguments we've just heard, you can easily access the two papers on the Minsk Dialogue website. But now we're traveling to Beijing, and it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Tian to share his immediate feedback and reactions to the arguments we've just heard. So please, Dr. Tian, the virtual panel and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the co-host of Minsk Dialogue and KS Belarus for inviting me into the dialogue. At this particular moment of the crisis of fighting the pandemic, which calls for collaboration, cooperation, and leadership, and as mistrust and misunderstanding grow between China and the US, and also as well other Western countries, it is more than timely and meaningful to have more dialogue and communications as we also do in Grandview Institution. I read the paper by our distinguished guest speakers and just listened very carefully to their presentation. It's really wonderful and informative. I really want to say thank you, because this is the most modest remarks for me and for China maybe, as we heard so much rhetoric from Fox and Pompeo. I should confess that I agree with both speakers on many of the points regarding the fact that China's behavior, whether strategic or technical, did arouse concerns and worries from many countries. But there are also many misunderstandings regarding the intention of China. Public opinion, international public opinion in many countries have turned more unfavorable toward China during the pandemic. Voices of criticism on China have more than doubled than before the pandemic. This is a fact we must face. Did China wage a war against any other country or want to initiate a third world war? This is not the answer. China has not been involved in any of the wars since our last war with Vietnam. If Chinese people just want peace and prosperity, then the reason is then why those unfavorable opinions and misunderstandings? Normally, when average Chinese, whether common citizens or government officials, heard criticism about China or words they do not like, they would instinctively want to defend and even fight back, which I always have reservations. I think at least we should listen and rethink profoundly, whether it is true or not. In particular, I used to be a lawyer. Is it based on law and facts? Is there something that China failed to do it properly? Is there misunderstanding in between? Taking this approach, I would like to talk first where China has not done well, which led to the situation where we were now. I'm a member of the Communist Party of China. It is also a good tradition within the party system to carry out we call it 自我批评, 批评与自我批评, criticism and self-criticism. A lot of the international public opinion unfavorable to China or misunderstanding regarding the strategic intentions of China relates to the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. It may date back to some particular time even before the pandemic, when some Chinese netizens or scholars tend to take a hate back or teeth for teeth approach whenever situations like this, where some country take actions against China or criticize China. But the flashpoint for this rhetoric this time is the alleged accusation of China taking economic coercion versus Australia, when Morrison calls for an international investigation into China's response to the pandemic at the very early stage. There are some points I would like to make here. These points apply to both circumstances of Australia and other situations where China is seen as taking wolf warrior approach. First, like many other countries, nationalism and populism also have a great impact on Chinese society. I mean negatively. When the diplomats or government officials handle domestic affairs or foreign affairs, they have to look after both the foreign counterparts and at the same time to accommodate the domestic public opinion, which more often than not are those from populism or nationalism because of the silent majority. Second, in terms of national psychology, this is a particular point. I have always worried that we have a long way to go to build a healthy, inclusive, and open psychology. In particular, after the reform and opening up, as the common Chinese become rich and wealthy, more and more Chinese are affected by two negative elements in terms of national psychology. One is victim-oriented national psychology due to long terms of occupation and invasion by foreign countries. This led to some Chinese be viewed as wanting to take in revenge. The other is new rich-oriented national psychology. People affected by this kind of psychology tend to showcase their being rich. They sometimes show pride. Deep inside, there are also a little bit of chauvinism due to some parts of the glory Chinese history. Those complex national psychology combine to shape some of the behavior which contributes to the negative image of wolf warrior. Third, due to the cultural traditions, on one hand, many Chinese like to hear good words or to look at only bright sides. We Chinese lack the sense of tragedy. On the other hand, some of the government officials and diplomats do not know how to nicely say no they just lack the skills. First, I think some Chinese have forgot our good tradition of hide your fame and capability to keep a low profile in Chinese 韬光养晦. I think it is not a strategy or approach, it is a philosophy. Last but not least, there is the chicken and egg logic. Unfortunately, most of the Chinese actions have been responsive and many do not know how to set agenda. For the case of Australia, it's the Australia who takes the first step to blame China for the pandemic. Those are reasons when I check and review from the Chinese perspective in terms of self-criticism. However, I don't think it accounts for a large portion of the reasons leading to the current situation. One important reason, which is often overlooked, is that there is an identity-oriented bias against China from largely the US, but also from the West as a whole. And there is a racial prejudice racism within the country, as shown by the death of George Floyd in the US. I do think there is also identity-oriented prejudice against communist China. As China does not share same social ideological system with the West, on many occasions, China is criticized just because it is China who did the same thing. I just take the Huawei 5G technology and the Hong Kong issue or BRA, for example. Huawei 5G is only a tool. Whatever system, social system, you can use it. We have used many technology from the West, but it does not hurt the Chinese social system. So why the same technology, when it is used by other countries, they should be worried about their social system be damaged? You heard a lot from the US delegation from the Munich conference. Hong Kong is the same. There are lots of criticism on China in Hong Kong issue, say that it damaged the Sino-UK declaration. But as in any other country, we also had the authority and competence to enact national secure laws, which we apply on any other regions. Just compare the riot in Hong Kong and the riot in the US. I didn't want to say more about that. You could compare the approach taken by the two governments. And also BRA, it's just, you know, when I went back to my hometown, there are many slogans writing on the wall. 要致富，先修路. If you want to be rich or wealthy, first you have to build roads and facilities. We have the experience, but just want to use this experience on international stage. That's it. And also because of the identity-oriented bias against communist China, all the Western countries have more tolerance towards the US. I just would like to take the example like the US has withdrawn from many multilateral treaties, and also the Middle Peace Plan is a blatant violation of international law. Just imagine if any of these actions are taken by China, what will be the response from the Western allies? Here I'm not making a too-cocky argument, but of course the most important of the reason is that there is the imposed China-US rivalry. I would emphasize imposed China-US rivalry. We don't want to want the China-US rivalry. It is imposed on China, beginning with the trade war, followed by the technology war, highlighted by the 5G. Of course, the concurrent pandemic gave the US another opportunity to change China, not only in terms of the blaming China for its own failure, but more because they are taking a whole of government approach to contain China, as reflected by their newly released strategic approach to China. Last but not the least, the systematic disinformation campaign against China by the United States. If you talk to the average Chinese, they didn't know the word. Even I, as an English-speaking Chinese, I have to consult the dictionary to find the exact translation for this word. But there are clear evidence that the US is conducting systematic disinformation against China. as evidenced by the memo for the Republican and also at the news report from the Daily Beast, that they have official lines from the National Security Council on how to make publication. And then what is the way out? Here I have 3 short suggestions. First, actions speak louder than words. If China wants to change its image, its international image, it's not because of the communication strategy, although I emphasize these elements. It will only because China did well. So the world will only change public opinion for China because China is doing well, not because China is saying well. The second is that China and the world, also the whole West, should try to find more identity to cooperate, like the climate change, economic recovery from the concession, and also non-traditional threats. In particular, as the pandemic has told us, the non-traditional threats will have more impact on our social life. Finally, I think there is no panacea for this kind of problem. I think we have to leave it to time to see whether the West worried is true or not. Just after 1 year, give China some time and also give you more time. I think for most of the Chinese people, as Premier Li Keqiang in a press conference has said, that still our biggest political task is still that we want peace and prosperity, because there are 0.6 billion Chinese people whose average monthly income is below 1,000 Chinese yuan. I will just stop here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tian. And we now get back to Minsk, Belarus, and it's my great pleasure to pass it over to Professor Kirill Grudy, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for invitation and for this interesting paper that we received. After listening to the speech by Dr. Tian, we see that this paper presents mostly Western view of the situation and how it's happening. Me personally, I left China in February in the eve of this coronavirus, not on the eve, in the one of the very striking moments of coronavirus in China. And I could say that that was very unexpected for everyone, was a shock for Chinese. And that was a chance that the world will be united at that time. And everyone would be helpful. And we saw that some countries tried to provide help to China at that time. Belarus as well. We sent, I believe, 2 planes with masks, with some medical equipment to China. And that was that moment, that was expectation that really coronavirus will change the world. But after several weeks, we saw that when the virus became really global, that every country began to fight with its own resources, and every country put their national policy as a priority. And we see right now that even in US, we still see that there are some internal political situation is more important than coronavirus. We see that forthcoming political events in Russia is more important than coronavirus, as well as probably in Belarus as well. We see our own political events is coming soon. So that expectation, at least my personal expectation, that coronavirus will change the world and we will be all united, was wrong. And we saw that national politics still was #1 in the agenda of decision makers. If we say a few words about China, I can say that China had 2 advantages after coronavirus. First one, if we compare with the whole world, first one in economy, as China was the first country who overcame the consequences of coronavirus. If we look at the annual basis me personally, I don't think that China will have decrease of GDP, the fall of GDP. It will be slowed down, I don't know, maybe 2%, 3% annually, but it's not the falling of economic growth compared to EU, compared to United States and other countries. So this is the first advantage for China to rush up its economic growth. Although Dr. Tian mentioned about fighting with poverty, yes, China will continue fighting, but it's probably the speed will not be the same like it used to be, but still it continue making big efforts. And the second advantage that China has after coronavirus is that exactly in 2020, China don't have any big political events. If we compare to United States with the election, if we compare with Russia and other countries, so that's why the politicians have to be flexible and they have to make a very complicated decisions about what should be the priority. Is this a medical, is this a people and you should fight with the coronavirus or you should prepare for the political events? This is exactly one of the reasons, to my opinion, why this US-China tension is going on, is because of the election in the United States, and China is a good card to play during the elections and to win for the Republicans. And we see that if we compare different parties, Democratic Party and Republican Party in the United States, so since, I don't know, 2011, Huawei and ZTE were always on the top of the agenda of Republicans, and they claimed Huawei and ZTE as the threat for the security and so on. But nothing really happened because they were not in power. And when they came to power, they just did what they promised to their people, to the electorate. So that's why if in November, the Republicans will be re-elected, so I believe the China-US tensions will continue. If there will be another president in the United States, probably times would be different. And once again, I would like to outline, it's not because of China, because we see that United States has some arguments against Japan. They have some arguments against European Union and some other countries with the trade war or with some trade tensions. So China probably is the most understandable, I wouldn't call it enemy, but counterpart for the electorate, US electorate. So easy for people to understand why Republicans are fighting with China. And finally, I would like to outline two cases for everyone probably to think about when we talk about these tensions between US tension and China tension, and we also talk about how China getting closer with Russia. I think we should differ trade economy with the politics, because still United States is the biggest trade partner for China. It's the biggest trade partner for the most of the provinces in China. And Russia still is not even the top 5 trade partner. Russia is very close, probably in the political agenda, in the political understanding of the world right now with China, but not as a trade. But in order for China to keep on going, to keep on growing, they need to trade, they need to be open, they need to import more. And China probably right now, or United States probably right now, still is the #1 partner, is still #1 priority for China. So I believe China wants peace with the United States, but right now is not the best time because of the election cycles. So I would like also to outline that. Thank you. I would stop here.
Thank you very much. Lots of great points, and we'll now go into a discussion. But before that, I just want to remind everyone who's watching us that you're free to ask questions, and particularly those who are here in Zoom. We already have quite a few questions, but if you want to ask more, so please use the chat feature of Zoom. Okay, so as we promised, the whole discussion will be somehow focused on the 4 key questions we are addressing, not only during this discussion, but during the whole project, which is the World HandCOV'd. And I think we seem to have responded the first one, which is about the sort of immediate implications of the pandemic for China. And I think everyone agrees that the pandemic as such has not changed the fundamental and dominant trends which have already been there. So many people make this case that the trends have only been accelerated. And actually, we've heard the very same argument in the 2 previous discussions we already had about Russia and China. So let me then move to the other question. I find it really interesting that both papers we have were making this point that there is a kind of a dilemma between China's rivalry with the US, great power rivalry on the one hand, and then on the other hand, stability, either regional stability in the Asia Pacific or international stability at large. And it really looks quite striking. So my first question here is, do you really think that the dilemma is sort of there, and there is no other way but for China to make an either-or choice? So either it continues with what is perceived to be growing confrontation with the US, and that it means necessarily that there will be destabilization in terms of security, or if not, like Professor Ruda just made this point, that US remains #1 priority for China, especially in terms of its economic impact. So does it mean that there is still a way for China to avoid the continuation of this great power rivalry? And it will be in this sense that stability will be upheld both in the Asia Pacific region and in the world more broadly. I throw this question to all the panelists, so please, you can just signal who wants to start. Okay, Dr. Tian.
I do agree with you on some point. Firstly, whether Donald Trump will remain in office or we have Democrats who take office, I think they will not change their strategy towards China, because up to now, it has become a all-of-government approach and their national policy. And secondly, and then if the United States, they just want to impose a rivalry strategic competition on China, what's the role of the EU and other countries will play at this particular moment? So I have a term that China, as it is imposed on China, we do not want anybody to take side, but we do expect that like the EU and UK or Russia to play a kind of role of strategic balancer and stabilize. We see that because although in the perspective of the average Chinese, we have the term West, but now we are seeing two different West. One West is US, or we are seeing the US and West, because the US is the other West is different from the US. The other West, they abide by the multilateral rules. They take the approach which is more cooperative, or which they will not take unilateral action. And also have a question to ask for other panelists. If the US do insist upon this rivalry on China, and if China is broken down, who will be the next? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who wants to deal with this question? Zach, please. And you were actually one of the authors making this very struck point that there is a dilemma between continued great power rivalry and the possibility to sustain international security and stability. So please go on.
Thanks, and I'm glad that you brought up this notion not just of regional stability, but global stability also being one of the dilemmas that China has to face in its own foreign policy. The argument that I'm basically advancing in the paper is that the great power rivalry at the global level that has been initiated can be mitigated to a certain extent, but not necessarily eliminated at this point. It has achieved a certain momentum of its own. And part of that has to do with structural dynamics that simply cannot be avoided at this point. One reason why people think that there is this sort of dual track that Leva referred to about China being simultaneously seen as a stabilizing and destabilizing force at the international level, people used to attribute that to China doesn't really know what its international aims are, right? It's still trying to figure out its own place in the world, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's accurate. I think that that's to a certain extent very orientalizing view of China that views its system as inherently opaque. I think we know enough about China's relationship with the rest of the international order at this point not to make that point anymore. I think that it's China's goals themselves that, as Dr. Chen was saying, lend themselves to an attempt at creating some sort of stable international order, but its very economic model itself produces destabilization to a certain extent because its economic model is somewhat incompatible with existing international institutions, right? So it's not because of China not knowing that we have this ambiguity. And then one other reason that we have this element of ambiguity is because of China remaining a partial power at this point. It still has to do with, and this is an old argument as well, this isn't a novel argument, this is, David Shambaugh made this argument most potently more than 10 years ago already. But the balance of power at the global level at this point lends itself somewhat to instability. You have a United States that is clearly in relative decline, but remains unquestionably the world's most powerful country and will be for the next several decades. And you have a China that has risen to the point that it is able to check American power, but not enough to assume certain elements of global governance on its own. And I don't think that it ever wants to, by the way. I mean, we should be very clear that those views emerging in Washington these days that China is able to or even wants to, quote unquote, dominate the world. This is not an accurate reading whatsoever. So the ambiguity there is largely because of our own interpretation of China and also because of the inherently mixed way in which China interacts with the rest of the world. And relating to something that Leva said and also that Dr. Chen mentioned about this notion of US-China bipolarity, and if not them, who else? Is it or is it not actually a zero-sum dynamic between the two of them? Leva made a very good point, a very, very good point that it's not necessarily a zero-sum relationship because both of them are possible, both the US and China are likely to emerge from the coronavirus as relative losers. Which one is going to be a greater relative loser is obviously a matter of contention. But the fact is that there are 2 points that I think that are worth making on that front. One is that, if not the United States and China representing the most important poles of the post-COVID world, well, then who else? Well, as we've been saying for decades already, the only alternative to that as a third pillar would be some sort of greater Europe that includes both the European Union and Russia in some sort of a common space, not necessarily, the fully fledged harmonization that was expected back in the 2000s, but the European Union and Russia alone are not capable of serving as a fully fledged pillar of international order. And as we've seen for years now, neither side is prepared to compromise on their fundamental principles in order to resolve, their disputes that have accumulated in crisis, which means that the two have just been utterly unable to serve as a means of slowing down this trend towards bipolarity. And the second point is that, of course, bipolarity, I think, is going to be, to a certain extent, not completely, obviously, but to a certain extent, accelerated by economic logic. And I know that Professor Rudi just mentioned that the economic relationship of the Russia-China bilateral ties is, to a certain extent, slower than their political rapprochement. And I think that's absolutely accurate. And part of that has to do with the fact that Russia does not want to integrate fully with China for fear of being unable to compete economically. Part of it is that Russia wants to maintain its own independence as a great power, and we see that economic and political security relationships in various types of relationships, do not always align, right? Take, for example, Australia, for whom the United States is the primary security provider, but China is the primary economic partner. But nonetheless, there is going to be a deepening economic relationship over time between China and the rest of Central Eurasia. I think that the dynamics of a Chinese state-led economy combined with continued lack of solid ground for a deeper economic relationship between the European Union and Russia, so long as the EU-Russia relationship remains on unsolid ground as it is right now, means that we will see with time and Alexander Gabuev made this point recently as well in an excellent article in Foreign Policy, that there will be a gradual and increasing consolidation of Central Eurasia by China over the years to come. So keeping that in mind, if we're noting again that there are impersonal normative forces that are at work here that are driving certain consolidations of certain spaces by certain great powers, I think that the notion that we could be heading nonetheless towards an across-the-board zero-sum rivalry is something that we should take very seriously. And if we fail to address this right now, if we fail to rally international support for additional polycentrism, for additional multilateralism, then we could be in significant trouble if we don't actually check our current predispositions and allow things to get further out of control over the years ahead.
Thank you very much, Jack. Could I just ask Professor Rudy to comment on this economic dimension of these processes? We keep hearing it all the time that, you know, this is inevitable, that Russia and China will be getting closer economically. But as you just emphasized in your introductory remarks, Russia is still not even in top 5 partners. And also what I keep hearing from Moscow all the time is that on a political side, there is a growing sense of, a growing concern that Russia needs to sustain its strategic autonomy vis-a-vis China. So where all these economic trends are leading the great power rivalry and specifically Russia-China relationship, please.
First, I would like to outline about economic ties between US and China. You know, we all know that China is still in a middle-income country, and China needs resources, China needs technologies to innovate and to get out of this middle-income trap that other countries are fallen and sometimes cannot get out. So I believe that China needs United States in order to develop, to continue developing. And this is a key point. On the other hand, probably Chinese, you know, diplomacy, Chinese external policy right now getting more and more stronger. And they are ready to, in order not to lose face, in order to respond in an accurate way or in the right way, they also provide some hard times for United States. And I don't think it's a good for both countries. And I here cannot agree with Dr. Tian about that if democratic office will be in United States and after November, situation will be the same. Probably before elections, in order to get the office, it will be the same. But after that, if we look at the old office before Trump, that all of them, after they got elected, after they received the White House, they changed their policy toward China. They became more pragmatic, they become more common sense, I don't know, and they start cooperating with China, and everyone wins after that. So I believe that this is the key issue that, especially from China, nobody wants these tensions with the United States, but they need to provide a feedback as a growing power and with strong diplomacy. If we come back to the China-Russia relations, well, if you look at the structure of the trade between Russia and China, we see that more than 70% that China is buying from Russia is raw materials. It's oil, it's gas. And before, Russia needs to persuade China, or I could say China needs to persuade Russia to buy something. And
we seem to have a technical problem, right? Dr. Rudy, do you hear us? Okay, in the meantime, Professor Rudy, do you hear?
Yes.
Do you hear? Oh, sorry, we had a technical issue, so please go on.
Oh, sorry. So I outlined very briefly that right now most that China is buying from Russia is raw materials. It's oil and gas, and before China needs to persuade Russia to get the best price. Right now, Russia tried to get to the China market, and they provide what China is needed right now. So this is, from my point, something that China gets more than Russia from China. And they will continue be more and more closer together because there are a lot of reasons, both cultural, historical, and personal even, that two leaders are very good friends. They meet each other very often, and they're very comfortable in making policy together. I mean, the president of Russia and the chairman Xi. So I believe they will continue making closer and closer, but right now China has their market economy. They have, I believe, true capitalism, and I don't think that any politician in China could tell the businessman where to buy. Otherwise, this businessman would say, well, in that case, you need to give me subsidy. And China is going away from this economic policy. So right now, there are two ways. One of the political, where Russia and China will continue getting closer, and business way, where China is continue getting, in order to get out of the middle income trap, they need to be closer either with United States or with EU as a Belt and Road target for them, but not Russia, because Russia is not so big market, economy is falling, incomes are falling. So I don't think there are any data that would support to make them closer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, let me finally invite you to step in. And Zach made a reference to your paper, saying that he disagrees with the point you made, which is about this uncertainty surrounding China. So do you have anything to respond? And also, I'm directing this original question to you about the dilemma, which you seem to be saying is inherent between continued great power rivalry and the ability to sustain at least regionally stability and security. Please, the floor is finally yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also very happy to join the discussion here today. And I'm also very glad that we have such open and diverse statements here among us. So I would say one of the things, when I look back also in the pre-COVID time, one essential thing coining this whole discussion we already had was, of course, the trade war between the United States and China. That absolutely is one of the accelerators for this whole big power rivalry, which we are kind of facing now in a much worse scenario, if you want. And I think so. As long as these consequences of this trade war are not yet settled, because we have the situation right now that after COVID-19, both economies, China and the US, are struggling a lot. We already heard that in China are about 17 million people who lost their jobs. So it will be a huge domestic topic also for the Chinese government to tackle this. And at the same time, of course, we see this really worse outcomes or the effects of the crisis now in the United States. So I think this, in terms of the international negotiation strategies, this is definitely a factor we shouldn't underestimate. But also to come back to what Dr. Tien said, and also gave us this more Western perspective on how we kind of wrote our article also about China. I would also like to make some very personal comments, because I used to work for a Chinese bank in Germany for 2 years. And so during the last 2 or 3 years, this kind of Chinese narrative that we live in a new era, and that this kind of global world is now very much shaped by China, and that is, of course, a big opportunity for Chinese companies to be part of it. This was very, very much one of these identifying factors, I would say, for my Chinese colleagues, for the whole, let's say, culture of the bank. It presented also in the global sphere. And I think this is, of course, something that brings together this kind of national unity and identity, but it also triggers a lot of negative implications, because it's right now in this crisis. I also observed that in the end, when there was this point where Europe and also the United States were hit much worse than what was in terms of the amount of people that have been affected by the crisis, that this was even a kind of a competition between people like the people of a nation who compared where are the numbers higher, which country or our government did a better job in terms of prevent a wider spread of the pandemic. So I think there is a lot of rhetoric that also shapes how countries negotiate with each other or are in discussions together, which is right now part of this battle of narratives that will definitely also make the situation worse. So we have to come back to let's say to find the interests where we really have something in common. This is absolutely the task now for our governments to take this very serious. This is especially a task for the Chinese government and for the United States, of course, in this aspect. And because we have to find again a common understanding of what multilateralism is. So China is now the big, let's say the competitor, the challenger of structures we are used to have and which worked quite well for quite a long time, of course, always with different perspectives and interests that have to be calculated in. But I think this is, the most necessary part now, that this understanding of multilateralism has to be advanced and not by other agendas, which will, in the end, also undermine the functioning of the different institutions. Maybe that's as a first comment on that.
Thank you very much. I see Dr. Tian's hand raised. Is it correct? Do you want to step in at this point?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to see a few points with regard to what has been said by my friends. On one point, I do agree with some panelists that they have confidence in the Chinese economy. We just have a dialogue with Japanese friends, and I listened to a presentation by the chief economics of the China Bank, and have more confidence in Chinese economy. I just want to highlight 2 points. One is that although for the past few years we emphasized on the export approach, but also when the pandemic have an influence on the export economy, we do need to turn to the domestic demand. We have a large domestic demand market. And also he mentioned one point which is very encouraging, that we have a term in China, we call it the 农民工, the workers from the farmer workers. Those of the workers will become a large force which will drive the Chinese economy. And also we are still in the process of urbanization. So I'm not worried about the trade war or technological war, although it will slow down the Chinese process of achieving prosperity. But I'm more worried about the military side. As you know, whether Trump or Biden take office, the US is now taking all-of government approach to contain China. What I'm worried is that if this kind of all-of government approach to contain China become a political right, and also if it spill into the military field, into the frontline operations, that will be a catastrophe. Because in the frontline military operations, it is the military professionalism which are called on to make decisions. That's one point I would like to make. And second, with regard to the multilateralism, I think that is one point. We share a common identity with most of the world. We actually uphold the multilateralism. We like the multilateral arrangements. That's what we want to cooperate with all the other countries. And finally, I just want to echo the points mentioned by just my German friends. I do agree with you that the populism or nationalism do have a negative impact on some Chinese people. And also because, you know, as the phenomena you mentioned are those of people who are netizens, but they are there is also a silent majority, but I do agree with you. I'm also worried about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these points. And when I hear you talk about the possibility of a military tragedy, I cannot but remember the points made by General Hodges during our first discussion about the US and strategic dilemmas facing the US. So General Hodges was very confident, I mean, not in a positive way, of course, that a real military clash between the US and China is inevitable within the next 5 to 10 years. So all these, of course, sounds very dramatic. But allow me to switch gears at this point and take the first question we have, which is from Denis Bukonkin. And Denis asks a lot of questions, as always, but the one I think we should focus on right now is about values. So all this discussion about growing confrontation between the US and China, or some people would say China and the Western world, is always framed in terms of values. So do you think we're really going to see something like the Cold War style growing confrontation based on values, not only on, let's say, some other concerns and other aims that great powers might have? So values, how relevant are they to this discussion? David, maybe we could start with you.
In my opinion, there are many aspects of values. There are some values that are shared by all nationalities, by all peoples. Because what is beautiful, what is nice, what is good in one country, in most occasions, are also the same in other countries. But I think the main challenge is from the imposed China-US rivalry. It's not because of the value. I think, speak of value, I think we can always find common identity in terms of values, like the keep a good environment, environmentalist, like the climate change. These are all values we share together. You know, in China, we have a term, 绿水青山就是金山银山. In English is that green waters and green mountains means golds and silvers. It's the same value in other countries. And also like the system, the laws, also the common values. In fact, I did my master's degree in UK, Nottingham University. When I was there, I always boast myself as a Nottinghamer. When I communicated with my classmates, I mean Chinese friends, because at that time in Beijing there is a big pollution problem. Now it has gone. We exchange our ideas with respect our impression about UK. Most of these students, they talk about the environment, but for me, I think one of the value advantage impression for me is that I appreciate the system, the small government system based on law within the UK. That's something we should learn from, because they have a very sophisticated legal system which clearly define the boundary between government and private sectors. So every person knows what right you have and what you expect others to do. So, but we are having a very big government. I think there is something technically, operationally, we should learn from those values which are embedded in the system of laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Microphone.
Please switch on the mic.
So yeah. So I try to make it short. The values is of course one of the major factors also in international relations, because it's in the end how we define our relations, how we actually shape multinational institutions as well, and also bringing up agendas and the way how we cooperate with each other. So I would say the approach, especially from democratic countries, and that's also, for example, what our foundation is also a part of, if you want, as a certain part of the foreign policy of our country, country is very value driven. And this is something that also has to be understood, of course, by, let's say, by other countries who are more based on other political cultures. And it's something that also expects from our side that dialogue, and in this term, especially also strategic dialogue, of course, also has to include both sides' ideas and perceptions. And it's very important, for example, that now as China, for example, emerges as a very important global actor, that in such circumstances, it's also very normal that from a messenger's perspective, that it's also necessary to have a perspective where you include, for example, domestic politics in the way how you engage with a country, because you can't just, for example, like approach a country by just merely looking on the common interests you have maybe in certain policy areas. It's very much about trust. It's very much about how the communication actually is developed, and that's why, for example, when you talk now and have a look on Hong Kong and also on the way how China is dealing with neighbor countries, and sometimes in a very coercive way, what I also mentioned or what we mentioned in our paper. This is something that can't be neglected from our perspective. So I think this is something, both sides have to learn, that values actually shape our international relations to a very important part.
Thank you very much. Zach, I see you want to tackle this question. Please do. But I also have an additional one for you, because we're really short of time. So please do address the other one as well, which is from Jan Drezel, who is based in Moscow. And he is asking whether you think that China is already too strong for the US to sort of reverse this growing competition. In other words, do you think that the US can still get things back to where they were like 2-3 decades ago in terms of world geopolitics? So please.
Sure, I think I can actually answer both questions at the same time because they're somewhat related. I'd like to respectfully push back a little bit on this notion of values being the primary frame of reference for the world that we're about to enter right now. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? I mean, number one is that democracies in the world do not all align with the Western political community. We've seen democracies like Brazil and India cooperate with Russia and China in various frames, in the BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the actual distribution of geopolitical interests is much more interwoven now. It's not as if you have a clear division between democracies and authoritarian states, and that many, in Washington are trying to push right now. And it's certainly not a clear-cut sort of two set of blocks as we had during the Cold War as well. Another reason to push back against this notion of a division between democracies and authoritarian states is because some democracies have proven their superior ability to tackle, for example, COVID, while others have failed utterly. And the same goes for certain authoritarian states where there have been varying ranges of success in combating it. And then finally, of course, we're living in a much more integrated economic system as well, which allows actually a lot of smaller countries to be able to develop relations with various great powers simultaneously and not to choose precisely. So this notion that the primary frame of reference going forward is going to be something related to values, let's be honest. I mean, we don't necessarily have shared values. We have very different models, very different ways of viewing the world. We have certain common understandings about how to engage with one another in the international space, and certain non-common understandings about how to engage with each other in the international space. So I think that the frame of norms is actually much more useful than that of values, which is what are the norms by which we're going to operate? What sort of economic models are going to be accommodating and will allow for, at the global level, some sort of coexistence between different domestic economic models? I think that's a very timely question that has only become starker as China has not opened up as many Westerners, I believe, falsely expected for some time. And what sort of norms should we use to regulate security and political relations as well? And this flows precisely into this question of US-China relations. Is there a way to restore the status quo ante at this point? Absolutely not. And it's part of that has to do with the fact that, yes, China has grown more economically and politically and militarily powerful in recent years and in recent decades. But it's more important than that. It's that some of the dynamics, even though it's possible to envisage some sort of détente or cooperative framework emerging at some point between the United States and China, the issues in their relationship are fundamentally zero-sum. And Ethan Paul had a great article on this recently in Responsible Statecraft, in the sense that you can either have an Asia-Pacific regional order rooted in U.S. primacy and U.S. leadership, or you won't. You can either have some sort of Chinese unification with Taiwan and with Hong Kong, or you won't. It's an inherently zero-sum dynamic within that relationship. And as a result, the question is, what norms will prevail in that region, in the Asia-Pacific region between the United States and China? You can't restore the status quo ante. And this does relate, and this is the final point that I'll make, again, to this notion that values should not be the framing point, because regardless of who, and I'll push back a little bit here against Professor Rudi's comment that you might see some change in the American approach towards China if the Democrats take back the White House. I don't necessarily see that being the case. Yes, Democratic and Republican administrations in the post-Cold War era have stressed different values and different approaches to international engagement at different times, but the overall American strategy has not changed. The overall American strategy has been to maintain global primacy and to maintain primacy in every geostrategically relevant theater in Eurasia. That's true of the Middle East, it's true of Europe, and it's true of the Asia-Pacific region. That has not changed under any administration. And I'm sure that in this upcoming election, it's going to be a competition between Vice President Biden and President Trump over who can, adopt the toughest approach vis-a-vis China. They might go about that in different ways, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which values they choose to stress in the international system. That dynamic of rivalry is going to continue. So the salient question going forward is, what sort of normative understanding can the two sides reach that can allow for some sort of coexistence despite the inherently zero-sum nature of their relationship, regardless of their divergence in values. Divergence in values should be taken for granted. That was always there. That's likely always going to be there. How can we regulate the relationship? That's the question.
Great, thank you, Professor Rudi. So please do add if you want on the values question. But I also have an additional question for you, which comes from Olga Lazorkina from the Belarusian State University. So the EU states are now talking about the need to transfer strategically important industries back to Europe, those which are currently located in China. How do you think this decision will affect the economic situation in China, if of course it happens? And how is it going to impact the Belt and Road Initiative?
A few words about values, very briefly. Everyone knows there is a World Values Survey when you can check the values of the common people. Maybe as a joke, but I strongly suggest to have the same World Values Survey for the decision makers. In that case, we will see if they share the same values with the broad public. If we're talking about the production and the factories that went to China in 1990s, and now because of the growing salaries in China, people are talking that probably they would go back to Europe or go back to the United States. Me personally, I don't strongly believe in that, because right now there is another incentive why they are going to China, because of the huge market, and the market is growing very fast, and it's always better to be closer to the consumer. If they want to get cheaper labor, they will go to Vietnam, they will go to the Bangladesh, go to the Southeast Asian countries where the salaries is not only lower than in EU, but also lower than in China. So I don't believe that will be the case, that factories will go back to the EU. It's kind of, to my point, is populist issue in the current administration in the United States, when they're telling that they will make that happen. But if we look at from the point of economists, not the political people, so we can say that both trade war and this movement of these factories, it doesn't make any sense from the economic point of view, because you cannot have a trade war between two countries. You always buy something from one country and use it as a raw material, and then export this. So this, if you ask any economic student, they will tell you that just don't make any sense if you have a trade war only between two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just before we close, the very last question to all the speakers, and we ask this question during all the events in our series, and this is about Eastern Europe, let's say the area between the core of the EU and some parts of Russia, the area where Belarus particularly is located. So could you please very briefly provide any suggestions, recommendations to policymakers in this part of the world, in Eastern Europe, as to how they should be dealing with this growing confrontation between the US and China and all those possible responses that might be coming out of Beijing? Can we begin with David again?
Yeah, thanks very much. Maybe one recommendation is, as we see different approaches now to connectivity coming up. We have a new European Union connectivity strategy, a platform that is also established. And of course, it's also about that the different strategies at one point have to come together, because in the end, it's about the bigger puzzle, the bigger thing that we really create more benefits in as well in those countries which are on the routes, if you want, between Europe and Asia. And I think it's not about picking a side or making certain decisions also on political and economic considerations only, but it's really about also how to shape the region as a country yourself. There's this, I would say, is the most dynamic aspect about cooperation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tian?
Thank you. I think for the worst scenario of the US-China rivalry, there will be no war because of the nuclear balance, nuclear deterrence. So if we put this as a precondition, what my suggestion to the Eastern Europe will be that I think for those countries, you should find common identities with either countries based on your own interest. I think we just talked about the value. I think diversity is also an important value. For example, as we are all recovering from the economic recession because of the pandemic, because we all want to get into normal, and that's the common identity. We can do it together. We can cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zach?
Thanks for the question, Zhenya. I think that the most important word in the context of Eastern Europe's role in a growingly rivalrous world is that of agency. I think that the region needs to find some sort of way to increase its own agency, and to a certain extent that is difficult because some members of Eastern Europe, depending on how you define geographically Eastern Europe, are part of the European Union and some are not, and you see this in China's engagement with the region as well. I think that by really developing more fora between these various countries of the region to be able to cooperate between themselves and assert themselves with a single voice will be very key, particularly vis-a-vis the core European Union members as well. Because one of the central questions vis-a-vis European countries' relationship with China going forward is going to concern the balance between how Brussels wants to engage with China and how individual member states are going to want to engage with China. And constantly, and we're seeing the same dynamic, by the way, in the relationship with Russia, where we're seeing the lowest common denominator approach taken in terms of the 5 principles of engagement between the European Union and Russia, while at the same time France is pushing for some sort of new relationship with Russia. We're seeing a similar thing in the case of China as well, where the approach being taken by Brussels and by the European Commission in particular differs somewhat, from the approach, say, taken by Germany, which views multilateralism and economic integration as an important motor of Germany's continued growth. So if we could see added agency among the countries of Eastern Europe to be able to push both EU institutions and core EU member states like France and Germany towards a common understanding of what a joint European approach towards China would look like, I think you'd be able to see greater stabilization of issues ranging from connectivity to institutions to other normative dynamics between both extremities of the Eurasian supercontinent, which in turn could be a very useful counterbalance to the increasing dynamic of rivalry within the US-China relationship.
Wonderful. And Professor Rudy, please.
Well, if we talk about Eastern Europe, we should remind everyone that about the 17+1 format, and Belarus is the observer there. I don't think that Brussels very exciting about this format because it's a little bit different from EU-China cooperation. It's something part of EU and China cooperation. Moreover, it's a more political issue because I don't think that 17 is a very attractive market for China as well. So this is something that we need to consider, this format that is happening. And also initiative of China, this Belt and Road initiative that go through Eastern Europe countries. And right now there are different attitudes to this initiative. And what we need to know more, what we need to get more is more successful cases. As soon as this Belt and Road initiative would be more practical, attractive for everyone, more and more countries would support that and join that. And coming back to the introduction of Mr. Wallenstein, he mentioned about that more and more Chinese science, Chinese languages now in Belarus. There is a very practical issue. Why is that? Because more and more Chinese tourists now in Belarus. And I can tell the statistics that in 2018, there were around 20,000 Chinese came to Belarus. In 2019, 30,000. It's not a too big amount, but still we see the dynamic, we see that it's growing. And this is a practical, successful case. We don't have any visa between China and Belarus. So that's a good issue to show to other countries that probably from this point is a successful case and attractive case in the Eastern Europe region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a remarkable and very insightful discussion, and it's really a pity we don't have much time to continue it. I also want to apologize for those who have asked their questions, but again, because of the limit of the time limit, we cannot address them. But in order to wrap up, let me pass it over to Jakub, who will summarize the discussion with a couple key takeaways.
Thank you, Zhenya. It's indeed quite difficult to have just a few takeaways since it was so dense and so much information. So before even starting, I recommend all of you to go back onto the websites of Minsk Dialogue and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to read the papers if you haven't read them. There's a lot to take away from them. So the question is, first of all, what is the effect of the COVID pandemic? And the authors of both papers agree that trends are speeding up. It's nothing substantially new, but things are speeding up. Professor Rudy added that his first impression that the world might change for the better has not really proven to be true, but it has shifted now towards national agendas, back at more pragmatism, countries trying to find solutions to existing problems rather than having a very optimistic new world. So we've been talking about Chinese role. There's been prejudice, as Dr. Tian pointed out, prejudice against China, which prevails. Levi and David named this a gap in perceptions and a lack of trust, which is the main stumbling block, as Levi said, for China now. The negative attitudes have risen throughout the world, and Dr. Tian pointed out cultural reasons for this, that people within China sometimes have a strong rhetoric and nationalism, but also there's a lot of misunderstandings in the reception of this, critical voices. Well, as Dr. Tian said, China only wants peace and stability and is a strong agent of multilateralism. What is the way out for China? As Dr. Tian also said, actions have to speak louder than words. Public opinion will only change if China's actions bear fruits and there's a perception change in the behavior. So we've been talking a lot about the dilemma, the big dilemma that all the three authors point out in their papers, the rivalry, big powers rivalry versus global or regional stability. Is there a zero-sum rivalry? I think Zach was the strongest to make this point, that there is a zero-sum rivalry around a lot of practical issues where there's just no different solutions. It's bipolar, but still the question is, how can this be mitigated despite some structural dynamics? So China is both stabilizing and destabilizing in some way, wanting peace, while at the same time having an economic model that is in its nature disruptive. So China is strong enough to check the US, is what you pointed out, Zach, but at the same time doesn't want and could not dominate alone. So the US was today the big elephant in the room, if you want. So both the US and China could be relatively weakened by the pandemic, but there's no third power emerging anywhere to play in the same league at the moment, since the EU and Russia are not able to join or not wanting to join forces. So the bipolarity is often sped up by economic logic. It's not very much always, as Dr. Tian said, dependent on values, but it's economics. There was disagreements on values, how much they count, but it's not the only reason here. But Professor Rudi made this point quite strongly, that politics and economics are not always the same. There can be strong political cooperation, whereas the stronger partner in the economic sphere might be a different one. So the US have not proven to be a global leader in this crisis. There has been a deterioration within only 17 years from the US being the non-challenged dominant force in the world to today's role where they're being challenged. So China's role has been ambivalent in this as a rising power. It's both strongly voicing for multilateralism and being a strong voice within international organizations, while at the same time building up its own institutions which go against the existing order. So China, the US elections was the question. So is there going to be a change, or would there be a change in case there's a change of incumbent in the Oval Office? We had a disagreement between panelists, Professor Rudi making a strong statement that the Democrats tend to be more win-win oriented and more diplomatic on China, whereas Dr. Tian and also Zach said that it's a structural question now, that this rivalry is not going to be over and not depend on the incumbent and the White House. We spoke about Russia also. The question was, will there be a stronger rapprochement between the two of them? Yes, there will, but at the same time, it's not going to replace, for example, the EU on economic terms. We also talked about the EU, which Dr. Tian at some point called the other West, different from the US. So in a decentralized world, the question was, how will regions emerge to be stable pillars and strong? The EU is hopefully going to be among them to remain a stable region in the world and be the more interesting market. And the question is, how will the EU be able to identify common ground with, for example, China and the US on multilateralism and also new threats? This is what David said. Concluding about Eastern Europe, just to remind you, we had the recommendations from David to look more at connectivity so that integration projects will match when they meet in the middle. Dr. Tian also pointed out to find common ground. Zach says Eastern Europe needs to increase its agency, both vis-a-vis external partners, but also within Europe against, for example, Brussels, what the countries in the east or in the center and the east of the continent want. And Professor Rudi just pointed out that projects like the 17+1, but also the One Belt One Road initiative needs to bear some practical fruits, which I think is a wonderful conclusion, because this is what the initial argument was, that actions speak louder than words. So if these initiatives bear some fruit and have benefit, this will also result in a more positive attitude towards China. This is it for today. We will have the conclusions also in writing in a few days, hopefully. Please check out both our website of Minsk Dialogue and CAS for the materials. We have the recordings of the last sessions. We have the takeaways in Russian and the papers of all the experts. So you can spend a lot of time there and still study what has been discussed today and over the last weeks. Next week, we're going to be back with NATO. So for the first time, looking at an institution rather than a nation state. So please make sure to be back with us next week. It is now my big honor to thank you all again. Thanks to our experts who took the time to prepare papers, to join us today, also at a very early and a very late hour, depending on where they're joining us from. Thank you to the audience for taking your time and your big interest in having these many questions. We were not able to address them all. Thanks to the teams, both of Minsk Dialogue and CAS, who prepared this technically today, to our interpreter. And by the way, to Dr. Tian for some lessons in Chinese. That was interesting. You brought up these terms a few times. I wasn't able to take notes of this, but it was good to have this cultural spice in the discussion. So thank you all to you. Be safe. Have a good day. Today is a Catholic holiday, so those of you who celebrate, have a good holiday. and a good weekend, and see you at this digital room next week.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Dankeschön, спасибо.
Danke, spasiba. How is that in Chinese?
再见。
谢谢，再见。
谢谢，再见。
Bye.